Like Thomas we've started the recording. For today's meeting, we're very pleased to welcome Azmal Hossan, I hope I got that right, who will be presenting his work titled Decolonizing Indigenous Climate Change Adaptation Research in the Missouri River Basin. Azmal Hossan is a PhD candidate in sociology at Colorado State University. His research interests are decolonization of research, Indigenous climate change adaptation, and environmental justice. Azmal's research is supported by interdisciplinary training, education, and research in food, energy, water systems, Diana Wall Sustainability Leadership Fellow at Colorado State University, Water and Society Fellowship at the American Geophysical Union, and Agents of Change and Environmental Justice Fellowship at the Mailman School of Public Health, Columbia University. As part of his environmental activism, Azmal has been contributing as a member of the Environmental and Science Advisory Board and a member of the Air Quality Monitoring Advisory Board of Larimer County, Colorado. With that, I will turn the floor over to Azmal. Welcome.
Thanks, Ruth. Hello, good afternoon. Let me share my screen first. Okay. Can you see the screen? Okay. Thank you so much, Ruth, again. And also, I'd like to express my gratitude to American Philosophical Society for giving me the opportunity to share my research in this Indigenous Learning Forum. And I'm fortunate, I feel privileged to be the speaker in the inauguration session of this academic year. And as Ruth introduced me, my name is Azmal Hossan. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology at Colorado State University. And also I've been working with Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance, a South Dakota-based tribal grassroots organization working for Indigenous climate resilience through the establishment of the treaty-mandated water rights in the Missouri River Basin. So Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance is also a partner in my community-engaged participatory action research PhD dissertation project. And today I'll share the my PhD dissertation proposal. Since I don't have any shareable data yet, I just defended my dissertation proposal. So it would be great for me to get some critical feedback from the audience in this session. So keep in mind, like I'm a non-Indigenous PhD researcher coming from Bangladesh. So I'm still in the learning process of Indigenous issues in the United States. So it would be highly encouraged to, if I get some critical feedback and questions on my project. Okay, so today I'm presenting Decolonizing Indigenous Climate Change Adaptation in the Missouri River Basin. And before I start with my presentation, I would like to navigate Colorado State University land acknowledgement. As you know, Colorado State University, as a land-grant university, acknowledges with respect that the land we are on today is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. This was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for numerous other native tribes. We recognize the Indigenous peoples as original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the ties nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. And with this land acknowledgement, I'd like to start a map here. I believe many of you are familiar with this map, which shows the Lewis and Clark expedition, and which is so important when I am presenting this presentation today. And this expedition was taking place between 1804 to 1806, led by two U.S. Army personnel, Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark. So why it is important to start my presentation with this Lewis and Clark expedition? If I go to the details of the expeditions, as I said, like it starts on May 14, 1804 from St. Louis, Missouri, and it ends on September 23, 1806. So this is the month of September that people probably in the United States will celebrate the completion of the historical expedition. And these Corps of Discovery teams traveled 8,000 miles in total in both route, and it took 2 years, 4 months long. And the leader of the Corps of Discovery, Captain Meriwether Lewis, was trained in botany, celestial navigation, medicine, and geology in Philadelphia, where the headquarters of the American Philosophical Society is located. So it is important because this is the first step that the European settlers in the United States, in the eastern part of the Mississippi River, got contacted with the indigenous communities who have been living in the western part of the Mississippi River for time immemorial. And this is the first step that United States government started to explore the Louisiana territory that they purchased from French authority in 1803. And within less than 1 year, the government led by President Jefferson initiated this Corps of Discovery. And this is the beginning of the what we called like westward expansion. And this expedition has huge implication on the indigenous communities in that region. And this implication is so relevant in the contemporary age when the indigenous communities in the tribal reservations are struggling to adapt with the climate change. So with this background, I would like to go like how this expedition is narrated historically in the US history. So you will find like thousands or dozens of literature on this expedition, but I'd like to share a couple of literature here. One is one of the famous book like Undaunted Courage, written by Stephen E. Ambrose, one of the prominent historian. And in this book, in the introduction of this book, he mentioned since 1803 and the return of the expedition in 1806, every American everywhere has benefited from Jefferson's purchase of Louisiana and his setting in motion the Lewis and Clark expedition. And we all live in a democracy and enjoy complete religious liberty thanks to Jefferson. And another book, which is so famous on the expedition, Passage of Discovery, the American River's Guide to the Missouri River of Lewis and Clark, written by Daniel B. Botkin, which is also a famous historian. But I would like to focus here the foreword written by the same historian, Stephen E. Ambrose. He mentioned like Lewis and Clark were pioneering naturalists who recorded dozens of species previously unknown to science, ranging from coyotes to prairie dogs to cutthroat trout, featured thousands of islands and sandbars separated by two constantly shifting channels. Dense forest, shallow wetlands, and endless prairie bordered the river, land filled with thousands of buffalo, elk, antelope, and grizzly bears. So if we consider these two statements, historians in the United States have been praising the US administration's attempt to explore the western side of the Mississippi River. And also they are praising the explorations of all of the more than human resources in the river basins. But what else they are left behind? They also talked about indigenous communities, but I would like to focus here one journal written by William Clark, the partner of the Meriwether Lewis, which he wrote in 1804 when the Corps of Discovery confronted the Teton Sioux in the Missouri River Basin. So he mentions like these are the vilest miscreants of the savage race and must ever remain the pirates of the Missouri until such measures are pursued by our government as will make them feel dependence on its will for their supply of merchandise. So you will find a lot of like good things about the friendly relationship between indigenous communities and federal governments or the people coming from federal agencies. But this is the most important thing I would like to focus here. And when William Clark was urging the federal government to take measures against or to manage these so-called vilest miscreants of the savage race, so what measures were pursued? I would like to focus also another incidents here, the Wounded Knee massacre. And I believe that many of you know, are familiar with this massacre. It took place on December 29, 1890 in the area of Wounded Knee Creek, South Dakota. And it is marked as the last major armed conflict between the United States and Plain Indians. And during this massacre, around 300 Lakota members who are like termed as Teton Sioux were brutally killed by the United States Army. And almost half of them were women and children. So I'm not sure like whether you are aware about that, why this massacre took place. There are a lot of reasons, but one important reason is the ghost dance. So if you are not familiar with the ghost dance, it is a Native American spiritual movement that started around 1870 among the Northern Paiute in Nevada. Then it was adopted by the Lakota people in early 1890 to address the violence they have been facing from the white settlers in that region. They also adopted it as a resistance to the forced assimilation, as a recovery mechanism from starvation they have been going through, resulting from the shrinking federal ration budget, and also as a restoration of Native American traditional lifeways in terms of their land management, in terms of their food systems, and which were disrupted by the settler colonialism and also severe drought during that region. So keep in mind, like, whenever we are talking about this massacre, it took place in 1890, when there are a couple of treaties were in place, signed by both the United States government, federal government, and the tribal governments. Specifically, we can think about the Port Laramie treaties that signed by the Lakota people and also the United States government. So this colonial violence is not unique in the United States. As I mentioned earlier, that I am from the Great Bengal Famine, which is current Bangladesh. This violence reminds me the colonial violence that my ancestor faced under the British colonialism. So I can refer one example here, the Great Bengal Famine of 1943 that took place during the World War II, when the British soldiers were fighting against the Japanese in the South Asian land. And this famine caused 3 million deaths. And there are a lot of reasons. One reason is the devastating cyclones that took place in the Bay of Bengal just 1 year earlier of the famine. But you will find hundreds of literatures that identify that it was the ignorance of the colonial British government which was convinced by the Malthusian food availability decline approach. So Malthus's food availability decline approach is propagating that people dies due to famine because of the population growth, and it is their own fault. And inconsistent with this bad approach, I would like to mention here one statement from the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, which was quoted in Tharur in 2010, like how the British rulers treated the Indian subcontinent, people in the Indian subcontinent. He is saying that I hate Indians. They are beastly people with a beastly religion. The famine was their own fault for breeding like rabbits. So from this perspective, we can say that the colonial violence is global. It took place in global south, it took place in global north. So it's universal. And this violence, I argue in my PhD project, that it is not material alone. Rather, it is epistemic, how we know what we know. It is ontological, the study of the nature of existence and being. And most importantly, from indigenous perspective, it is cosmological, how we study the origin and development of the universe. And I argue that in my project that climate change, which is definitely anthropogenic, has become the newest iteration of this violence. And my argument is not coming from a vacuum. Rather, it is scientifically established right now. If we look at the two most prominent literature or scientific reports on climate change, one is 6th Assessment Report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the another one is the 5th National Climate Assessment Report produced by the United States Global Change Research Program, which is under pause right now under the current administration. They established a clear connection between colonialism and the climate change vulnerability of the indigenous communities, people of color. So IPCC mentions that vulnerability is exacerbated by inequity and marginalization linked to, for example, gender, ethnicity, low incomes, informal settlements, disability, age, and historical and ongoing patterns of inequity, such as colonialism, especially for many indigenous peoples and local communities. And the United States Global Change Research Program is also echoing this understanding. They're arguing that by exercising their right to self-determination, indigenous peoples can respond to climate change in ways that meet the needs and aspirations of their communities. However, their ability to exercise this right is often undermined by institutions and policies shaped by the impacts of settler colonialism. So given this perspective, I would like to focus on the climate change scenario in the Missouri River basins. So you will find like dozens of literature on the warning, persistent warning of drought in the Missouri River Basin, and which is induced by anthropogenic climate change. If you look at the map here, you will find that Missouri River Basin has been experiencing semi-permanent drought, ranging from abnormal dry to extreme drought in the last couple of years. But despite this warning and experiences of the drought, the climate change modeling simulation are arguing that the runoff in the Missouri River Basin is increasing in the recent climate as compared to the past climate. If you look at the map in the right side, that you can see here that the upper basin is experiencing more than 6% of runoff increase, while the lower basin is experiencing more than 17% runoff increase. And this increase is not taking place due to the anthropogenic climate change. Rather, they are arguing that it is taking place due to the internal multi-decadal variability in the climate system, which increases the precipitation and decreases the temperature. So this scenario is producing a hydroclimate puzzle in the Missouri River Basin. And this hydroclimate puzzle is intensified because Missouri River Basin is one of the most contested, most complex, the longest river basin in North America, most contested, and also it has the most complex reservoir system. If you look at the map here, that it covers 10 US states, 2 Canadian provinces, and almost 29 indigenous reservations. And this hydroclimate puzzle is also intensified by the distinctive water concern of the upper basin states and lower basin states. So whether upper basin states is concerned with the water shortage, so their main concern is about irrigation, storage, allocation, and conservation of water. On the other hand, the lower basin states are struggling with water abundance. So their main concern are flood control, navigation, land drainage. And also this hydroclimate puzzle is intensified because the Missouri River Basin is located in the most agrarian and agricultural region in the nation, which is known as the breadbasket of the country, producing 46% of wheat, 22% of grain corn, and 34% of cattle. And also the river basin, through its main stem dams, through the complex reservoir systems, it has become one of the major sources of energy, both renewable and non-renewable. So there is a growing concern or tension between the food systems and also the energy systems. And as I mentioned earlier, the upper basin states and lower basin states in terms of getting access to water in the river basin. And all of these complexities are becoming a constraint for the indigenous communities, along with the climate change and also history and legacy of settler colonialism in getting water to sustain their traditional life ways and to adapt with the changing climate. So my PhD project is grounded on the indigenous climate change studies proposed by Professor Kyle White. According to him, indigenous climate change studies is, the indigenous climate change observation in the Missouri River Basins. So there are a couple of studies I'd like to focus on here, that indigenous elders are often observing the long-term changes in the local climate, focusing on various climatic events like declining winter snowfall, milder winters, and warmer summers. And this climate change brought negative consequences for the indigenous reservations in terms of their subsistence food plant, subsistence fishing, ceremonial practices, local water resources. And their observation is most importantly, is consistent with the climatic data. And these observations also, although this is from the Crow Indigenous Reservation, this observation is applicable to other indigenous communities in the Northern Great Plains regions of the Missouri River Basin. And also because of like rurality and remoteness, indigenous communities in the Missouri River Basins or Northern Great Plains are often maladapted or often vulnerable in terms of climate change adaptation. And as I mentioned earlier, that my PhD dissertation project is founded on the indigenous climate change studies proposed by Professor Kyle White. It is a field created by indigenous and allied scholars, knowledge keepers, scientists, learners, change makers, and leaders, aiming to support indigenous people's capacities to adapt to the anthropogenic climate change. And he identified there are 3 themes in indigenous climate change studies. Number 1, climate change is an intensification of environmental change imposed on indigenous peoples by colonialism. Revitalization of indigenous knowledge can strengthen indigenous communities' self-determination capacity so that they can plan for climate change adaptation. And also, indigenous peoples often imagine climate change futures from their perspective. And I'd like to focus here on whenever we are talking about that indigenous traditional ecological knowledge can help indigenous communities to adapt with the changing climate. So I'd like to focus here a couple of definitions of indigenous knowledge. One definition I'd like to quote here from the US Department of the Interior. It refers to a body of observations, oral and written knowledge, innovations, technologies, practices, and beliefs developed by indigenous peoples through interaction and experience with the environment over millennia and passed from generation to generations. And this knowledge can be applied to biological, physical, social, cultural, and spiritual systems of the indigenous communities. So given this background, I developed a couple of research questions to examine in this project. The number 1 is, what is the current state of self-determination capacity of the indigenous nations in practicing traditional life ways in the Northern Great Plains, given the history and legacy of settler colonialism? How do indigenous nations perceive settler colonialism interfering with how they are affected by climate change in the Northern Great Plains? And how can indigenous knowledge practiced by indigenous nations for time immemorial inform their climate change adaptation capacity? And also, to what extent is indigenous knowledge relevant to Western science in producing climate change adaptation knowledge? To examine this research question, I would like to express my social positionality and standpoint. As I mentioned that though I'm a non-Indigenous member, but I was born and raised in a post-colonial territory, which is the Great Bengal Delta, current Bangladesh, which is popularly known in the global climate change adaptation literature as the epicenter of climate change and climate heterodystopia, climate dystopia and adaptation regime, which is known as a place of climate reductive translation and a meta code of climate change, where nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation often turns into green colonialism and also where critical analysis and knowledge production are reserved for Western scholars because of the history and legacy of colonialism, and which is also known as a aid lab imposed by the aid agencies, specifically from global north. So you can see like climate change is a lived experience for me. And I found consistency with my lived experiences with the indigenous communities in the global north, given the history and legacy of settler colonialism and also the existential threat coming from climate change. And in order to examine the research questions I proposed, my study is founded on some theoretical argument. One theory is climate coloniality, proposed by Professor Farhana Sultana. She's also from Bangladesh. So I have the similar lived experiences and climate change experiences. She's arguing that critical coloniality is a critical framework. Climate coloniality is a critical framework for understanding the contemporary climate crisis. She's arguing colonialism uses climate change as a tool to haunt our past, present, and future. And she also identified that there is an interlocking system of colonialism, racial capitalism, imperialism, neoliberal globalization, international development, media discourse, and education in producing climate injustice, which is distributed historically and especially across different groups. And the impacts of climate coloniality, according to Farhana Sultana, it produces an unbearable heaviness. So what we need to do, we need to decolonize the narratives of climate change, both materially and epistemologically. Why it is important? Because I argue that decolonization is not a metaphor. Along with the epistemological decolonization, we need to decolonize the climate change narrative or climate change adaptation narrative materially and politically too. So what is decolonization? It is an ongoing anti-colonial process that resists and challenges the logic of colonialism in all its manifestations and recognizes indigenous ways of thinking and being. It acknowledges, respects, and empowers indigenous knowledges, worldviews, values, and modes of living, which includes indigenous societies' governance and management of human-environment relationships based on environmental ethics of care and reciprocity between human and non-human beings. It is an unending and transformative process of unlearning, relearning, and becoming who we are as researchers, teachers, and citizens. Another theory is indigenous environmental justice. I would like to express here, like, we are familiar with the mainstream environmental justice. So how indigenous environmental justice is different than the mainstream environmental justice. So while the quotation is I'm using here, it says, while all indigenous environmental justice issues are environmental justice issues, not all environmental justice issues are indigenous environmental justice issues. Environmental justice issues are found where we live, work, go to school, and play. For indigenous peoples, indigenous environmental justice issues occur where we live, work, go to school, and play, and most importantly, where we pray. So whenever we are talking of indigenous environmental justice, we are specifically focusing on their attachment with sacred lands, where they live, work, go to school, play, and most importantly, they pray. And there are three factors that differentiate indigenous environmental justice from environmental justice. Number one is Native American tribes are government, not ethnic minorities. I mentioned like treaties, the Port Laramie treaties, they're signed by the Lakota nations and also the federal governments. According to the treaties, that each tribes are sovereign government, and they have a strong connections with their traditional homelands, and they are confronting the continuing effects of colonialism. So whenever we are talking about indigenous environmental justice and how colonialism has been perpetuating these injustices, settler colonialism is eminent to talk about. So what is settler colonialism? It's a land-centered specific social formation, a structure. It is not an event that persists over an extended period, operates through a logic of elimination, not genocide, to get access to territory, destroys to replace, and is foundational to modernity. It is an ecosocial structure disrupting indigenous ecosocial relations. It is an invisible situation not restricted to a specific group, location, or a period. Its location is difficult to determine. Sometimes it is invisible. And it has a distinct transnational formation. So I'm a sociology a graduate student. So whenever we are talking about settler colonialism, it is important to refer one of the quotations from the Communist Manifesto written by Marx and Engels. Although they did not mention the settler colonialism as a term, but they are projecting that capitalism is highly integrated with the settler colonialism. So in the Communist Manifesto, they are arguing that the need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeois over the entire surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. So this quotation from Marx and Engels is highly significant if you want to study settler colonialism. And this is a definition of settler colonialism provided by Professor Kyle White. For the sake of time, I'm not going through these definitions. But another theory I am using, theory of collective continuance, proposed by, again, Professor Kyle White. And he is proposing this theory of collective continuance as an adaptation strategy for the indigenous communities through their self-determination. So according to him, the collective continuance refers a society's capacity to self-determine how to adapt to change in ways that avoid reasonably preventable harms. And he identified 3 concepts in Anishinaabe intellectual traditions based on which he proposed this theory. Number 1 is interdependent relationships. So indigenous communities, specifically the Anishinaabe people, maintains a reciprocal relationship between their environment. For example, he identified that Anishinaabe people treat land as Emin Goyak, which refers to reciprocal gift. Second one is systems of responsibilities, which refers to the relationships with reciprocal expectations with the environment. For example, he identified that Anishinaabe people follows seasonal round system so that they can harvest resources from the nature seasonally and sustainably. And third one he identified is the migration. It doesn't necessarily mean the human mobility. Rather, he refers migration as how societies are organized to best adjust to the ecological and social dynamics they face. For example, Anishinaabe people follows 13-moon system. They specify each season with a moon and follow the moon system to harvest resources from the nature for their own survival. And methodologically, I'm using a postcolonial indigenous research paradigm, which was proposed by Bezele Chilisa, a postcolonial scholar from Botswana. She was, although from African continent, but she was academically trained in the United States. And she was highly disturbed by the Euro-Western research process, as she believes that it disconnects her from the multiple relations that she has with her community, the living and the non-living. According to her, Western research paradigms excluded the colonized other from the knowledge production system. And postcolonial indigenous research paradigm is a framework of belief systems originated from the lived experiences, values, and history of those neglected and marginalized by Euro-Western research paradigms. It incorporates the shared aspects of ontology, epistemology, axiology, and methodologies of the colonized others. So why I'm using this postcolonial indigenous research paradigm? Because as I said earlier, that I'm not an indigenous member, but I'm coming from a post-colonial territory. So I'm trying to blend together my post-colonial lived experiences with the indigenous experiences in the United States. And using the post-colonial indigenous research paradigm, I'm doing this research as a participatory action research methodology. As I mentioned earlier, that I've been partnering with Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance, a South Dakota-based indigenous tribal grassroots organization. So I have been, from the very beginning of the research process, I have been actively working with the 2 tribal climate resilience liaisons and program managers of the Great Mistral Water Alliance. And I've been providing periodic updates to the board of directors, who are the water resource managers of the 7 of 9 federally recognized indigenous nations. And as part of my participatory action research, I organized a workshop last year with the indigenous knowledge keepers, including elders, leaders, managers, and the historic preservation officers, that took place in South Dakota, Santisu tribal reservations. And there are a couple of reflections I received from the workshop. That decolonization is an ongoing process of unlearning and relearning, which is consistent with the decolonization definitions I provided earlier. And building trust is urgent with indigenous communities, and it cannot be achieved overnight. It's a time-consuming, it's a long-term process. And indigenous communities have been experiencing multi-generational trauma, which requires multi-generational healing. And sometimes reminding this trauma would generate more trauma among the indigenous communities and creates barriers for collaboration. And it is important to respect local knowledge and prioritize community needs over academic methodologies whenever we are building relationship and collaborate with indigenous communities. This is important because I will talk about it. And as part of my post-colonial indigenous research paradigm, I am planning to use 2 data collection tools or method. One is philosophic sagacity interview method. It is an Afrocentric indigenous method, which is a reflective system of thought based on people's wisdom and traditions. And we know that wise leaders in the indigenous communities are the source of vast amount of knowledge. And this philosophic sagacity interview method will help me to collect a large body of knowledge from the sages, like wise people from the community, which is not available in the written literature. And another approach or method I planning to use, which is talking circle, which is similar to Western focus group discussion, where all the members don't get an equal chance to be listened in the focus group discussion. So in talking circle, there is a mutual respect among the participants in the core principle, Forming a circle occasionally is a common practice in indigenous context. For example, they may form a circle around the fireplace during celebrations or in games. So it would be convenient to organize this talking circle. And in this talking circle approach, a person is given to speak uninterrupted and to be listened to by circle members silently and non-judgmentally until he or she finished. And in this process, a sacred object like a feather, a shield, a stone, a basket, or a spoon is passed around from speaker to speaker so that they are engaged meaningfully with each other in the data collection process. And this is the sampling and data analysis strategy. I will use a purposive sampling. I will select 2 out of 9 indigenous nations in South Dakota. Then I will employ a quota sampling to identify the respondents from 2 indigenous nations. And my participant will be knowledge keepers, which are elders, leaders, natural resource managers, history preservation officers. And I will follow the theoretical saturation. If I find that there are no new informations in the data collection process, I will stop the interview and also talking circle process. And the interview will be recorded. They will be transcribed and also coded and for thematic analysis. And research summaries and deliverables will be shared with the research participants when they are available and for their consent and for their critical feedback. And ethical consideration is so important whenever we are working with the indigenous communities, because research is one of the dirtiest words in the vocabulary of indigenous communities, although they are the most researched communities in the world. So I'm going through the IRB approval process at both Colorado State University and also indigenous governments in South Dakota. I will comply with 2 principles recommended by the climate and traditional knowledge work groups, provided in its guidelines for considering traditional knowledge in climate change initiative. So number 1 principle is cause no harm. And number 2 is free, prior, and informed consent. So whenever we are talking about like, we are not intended to cause any harm, We'll define the roles and responsibilities clearly and carefully. We'll define what information will be shared. We'll establish use, ownership, and means to interpret or share information. And we'll ensure respect, trust, equity, and empowerment. And for pre, prior, and informed consent, pre means like procedural fairness in negotiations. Prior refers Indigenous peoples should be involved from the beginning, very beginning of the project. And also informed, they should be informed about the cost and benefits, risk and opportunities. And finally, consent. They should have the right to decline to engage and say no in the engagement process and data collection process. And I think that's all from this project. Thank you so much for your patience to hear me. And I'm expecting some critical feedback and question.
Thank you so much, Azmal. Going to give everybody a little bit of time to think of their questions. And if you do have a question, you can either type it into the chat or raise your virtual hand or type your name in the chat, and I can call on you to speak. Anybody?
Should I stop the sharing?
Yeah, you could stop the sharing so we could see the whole group.
Okay, thank you.
There's lots of applause. Any questions coming up? I'm sure people have some questions. And remember, Azmal is at the beginning of this process, so I think I get the sense you are open to suggestions as well as questions.
Oh, definitely, yes. This is I think this is the main objective for me, to get some critical feedback and also suggestions, along with questions too.
Well, as we're waiting for people to raise their hands, I will start off with a question. So I'm really intrigued by you bringing in like this very global perspective and set of research methodologies from Africa and from your experience in South Asia. I'm wondering, and I think that there's like a lot of potential there to enrich sort of decolonial studies in the US, but also enrich those schools outside of the US, outside of North America. But I'm wondering if you have any concerns about doing that, or if you see any potential pitfalls or drawbacks to bringing sort of a very global perspective to this.
Yeah, that's a great question, Ruth. I really appreciate. I understand what is your concern. As I proposed, like the postcolonial indigenous research paradigm is an Afro-centric, Africa-centric research methodology. But as I mentioned earlier, like colonialism is a global issue. And it doesn't matter whether we are living in global north or global south, so-called global north and global south. The experiences of colonialism by the colonized entities, whether they are indigenous communities in the US or the people of color in the global south, are common, and they have commonalities in terms of history and legacy of colonialism, and most importantly, climate change. Right? If you look at the climate change, we call it anthropogenic. So who are contributing most? It is the privileged class in global north, who are predominantly white, and it is it is the people who are suffering the negative consequences of climate change. It is the indigenous people in the global north and marginalized people in the global south. So for both indigenous communities in the USA and people in the colonized people in the global south, whether it is Africa or South Asia, they have common lived experiences whenever we are talking about interlinking connection between colonialism, climate change. And if we want to decolonize, as I mentioned in my presentation, that I'm aware about it, that I'm not an indigenous member, but I have a lived experience of colonialism. I'm from a post-colonial territory. So I tried to blend together my lived experience as a post-colonial entity and also the lived experiences of the indigenous people in the USA. And I talked about it with the Great Struggle Water Alliance, and I didn't hear any, as you raised the concern, still any concern from them yet.
Thank you. We have a hand raised, Bob Newman. You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much for having this session, and really interested in your work. I've been thinking a lot about these things over the years. So first of all, I'm also non-Indigenous. I think we should be upfront about our positionality. I'm on the faculty at the University of North Dakota. I work with Northern Plains tribes, and we've just been talking about doing some climate adaptation work, specifically in the upper Missouri Basin. I also work with the TEK section, that's what it's still called, in the Ecological Society of America, and Native Peoples Wildlife Management Working Group in the Wildlife Society. So like I said, I've been thinking about these things for a while, and I think that the theme that you're proposing is a really important one. I think it's a really critical one. And the question that I always have is, if we suppose that we accept that decolonizing, I'm reading your title now, decolonizing Indigenous climate change adaptation research is what we have to do. And I would go, I would say, in addition to that, I would say that Indigenous communities should be leading climate adaptation work and conservation work in general. So my question to you is, what does it take to actually make that real, in the sense that if we all step back and say tribes or Indigenous communities should be leading this work and we should be decolonizing, what do they want to do that they can't do now under a settler colonial system? And what would they need in order to be able to move things in the direction that they want to go? Do you have any sense of that?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Thanks, Bob, for your such compliment, and also for the questions. And this is the most pressing question, like, what does it mean for the indigenous communities when we, as a researcher trained in the settler colonial academic institutions, are proposing that we want to decolonize your climate change adaptation? So this is the most pressing questions. And as I mentioned, like in the theory of climate coloniality, Professor Farhana Sultana, she's proposing that we need to decolonize both materially or politically and epistemologically. Because as I mentioned, climate change is not a metaphor, which has been used historically. So as I mentioned, I would like to refer another project I've been doing with Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance. I'm assessing tribal climate change adaptation water needs and priorities in whole northern Great Plains as part of my job at Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance. I'm done with South Dakota tribes and currently working in Nebraska and Montana. But one statements from one of my participants in the research, one of the tribal water resource managers. One quotations I can refer. They were saying that they often write report for us, but they have never been here. So this is the material decolonization issues. You are proposing decolonization proposal, you are proposing Indigenous climate change adaptation project without any meaningful input, without their consent, without their participation in the process. So that's why I propose that I have been, from the very beginning of my research process, I proposed the idea in the board of directors of the Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance. They spent a session talking about it, and they acknowledged the importance of the project, and then they gave their consent. Okay, it would be great project together if we implement together. So historically, what has been taking place by the researcher that we often use the term like helicopter science or parachute science. They did research, they collect data from the indigenous respondents, and they left the indigenous communities with the data, and then they used it for their own professional development, for their own personal gain. So there has been no like community like benefits coming out from the research. So that's why there should be a negotiations between researcher and also the indigenous communities, that what would be the end game of these projects, how both indigenous communities and researchers can get benefit, and what would be the data sovereignty issue, how the data that indigenous communities or indigenous partners are providing us as part of this project, how will the data be managed, analyzed, and most importantly published. So this is the main pressing question, and as a decolonizing early career researcher, this is a learning process for me, that how can I ensure the data sovereignty for my partners. Yeah, thank you. And also, if I add another thing, like if I think about material decolonization, so what is the material gain for the Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance, for example? So I'm thinking to start a conversation with them, that whether we can develop any inventory of traditional ecological knowledge that has been practiced for time immemorial in this region, but currently under threat due to settler colonialism, which can be shared with all the partners of the Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance in that region. So that would be another example of material decolonization, probably. Thank you so much for the question.
So we're just about out of time. We have a question in the chat from Tasfia Tasnim, who unfortunately already had to leave. But they say colonialism is an ongoing process and it's very political too. I was wondering if you can also link the decolonial political ecology and bring the power and politics issue into your research. And then they say I have to leave in 7 minutes for another work, but I would like to have a chat with you later. Great work, Azmal.
Yeah. Do you want me to respond to the question, or?
If you'd like to, we should wrap up soon, but if you want to give a short response, that's fine.
Okay. So as a social scientist, early career social scientist, I believe everything is political. At the end of the day, or if you look at the like global political scenario right now, specifically in the United States, how it is affecting the climate change or climate change science. So colonialism is definitely a political project, and it brings a lot of negative consequences for the colonized territory, for the colonized entity. And as I said, that's why we need to initiate the decolonization politically first. And for that, we need to come forward collectively. It may be coming from our moral obligation, from our own professional responsibility. So it would be ideal, like if we come forward, each and every individual who are committed with the decolonization process, so that we can reshape the political landscape which acknowledges the history and legacy of colonial violence, and then ensured all of the components of environmental justice, like distributive, procedural, and recognition justice.
Thank you. There are no more questions, but a couple of comments from Bob, which I'll just read so that they're on the recording. Bob says, I'm a big fan of Farhana's work, and then recommend also the STACC report 2025 from ITEP and Laura Jacobs' work.
Yeah, thank you so much. I already collected the reports. It is I think the second edition of the report, probably. Yeah.
And Azmal will share the full chat transcript with you too, so you can see things that you might have missed as you were talking.
Yeah.
And I just want to take a moment to thank you again for kicking off our 2025-2026 Indigenous Learning Forum with this really interesting, provoking talk. And thanks to all of you who joined us to listen and pose your questions. And I hope you'll join us next month for the second talk in the series. Have a wonderful evening. And,
yeah, thank you so much for giving me the platform. And I'm so glad and privileged and honored to be part of this Indigenous Learning Forum. And I look forward to the upcoming sessions.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great evening, everybody.